Okay, everyone, welcome to part 2 of chapter 15. So it is Sunday night, and I posted the Module 1 notes and audio last night. So tonight I have finished Modules 2 and 3. I'm going to post both of those, and I want to see how long it takes me before I get started on Module 4. So in this module, we're going to talk about personality disorders and dissociative disorders. The next one, we're going to talk about mood disorders, and then the fourth module is entirely on schizophrenia. While I think it is a fascinating disorder and something that I do want to talk about, I just want to see how long it takes us to get through the Module 2 and 3 stuff first, because we want to make sure that we're not taking up too much time. So I noticed that the Module 1 slideshow, I think it came in at 23 minutes yesterday. So if we're thinking about the fact that we have 3 50-minute periods of class time, that means we have 150 minutes or 2 hours and a half to basically get through chapter 15. So I'm going to definitely try to keep it well below that range, and then we will get started on chapter 16 in the week after. So let's see how it goes. The personality disorders chapter, I honestly found that this text left out a lot of stuff that I would consider somewhat important for some of these disorders, and it also added in some stuff that I thought was just, it's good to know, stuff concerning how the disorders develop and some of the different factors that are involved in their development, so biological, cognitive, social, psychological factors. But I'm going to try to limit the amount that I talk about that kind of stuff, just in the interest of time, so we can mostly focus on the specific disorders and how to define them. So, Module 15.2 is personality and dissociative disorders. So we're going to describe what a personality disorder is and talk about a few kind of major examples of personality disorders, and then we'll talk a bit about dissociative disorders and a few examples of those. In terms of defining and classifying personality disorders, a personality disorder is defined as a particularly unusual pattern of behavior relative to one's cultural context, because as we know, usual and unusual behavior varies from culture to culture, that are maladaptive, distressing to oneself or others, and resistant to change. So for example, having no empathy, having very intense needs, and requiring a lot from other people around you, or developing extreme forms of attachment, all of those may be patterns of behavior that might be indicative of a personality disorder. So the DSM, which is that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that we talked about in Module 1, identifies 10 distinct personality disorders, which are characterized into 3 different clusters. We have Cluster A, which is characterized by odd or eccentric behaviors, Cluster B, which is indicated by dramatic, emotional, and erratic behavior, and Cluster C, which is characterized by anxious, fearful, and inhibited behaviors. So in this section, in the interest of time, we're not going to go through all 10 disorders. Your textbook basically focuses on the 4 disorders listed in Cluster B in order to get a sense of the commonalities within a given cluster, as well as the specific factors that differentiate them. So we want to see what is the reason that they're all classified within the same category as personality disorders and as kind of within that specific cluster, but also the things that distinguish one disorder from the other. So table 15.2 just shows a bunch of types of personality disorders. So within cluster A, we have paranoid, schizoid, schizotypal personality disorder. Those are all very interesting, and they're things that I've talked about in the past in other classes, but for the sake of time and also because this textbook really only focuses on cluster B, we're going to focus mostly on the disorders listed there. So borderline personality disorder, which you've probably heard of, narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. And then cluster C also contains some types of personality disorder that are really kind of characterized by anxious and fearful behaviors. So obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is very similar to obsessive compulsive disorder, which we'll talk about in the next module. Avoidant, dependent, and personality disorder not otherwise specified. So we are going to focus on cluster B in our kind of overview of personality disorders. So the first thing we'll talk about, the first disorder, is borderline personality disorder. It's a disorder characterized by intense extremes between positive and negative emotions, an unstable sense of self, impulsivity, and difficult social relationships. So people who suffer from borderline personality disorder have a really hard time making and maintaining social relationships. They have a lot of trust issues, and they have a lot of fear of abandonment. So the relationships of people with BPD are characterized by instability and intensity. They may fall in love quickly but be highly fearful of abandonment, and unfortunately one of the ways that they react to a perceived abandonment is to be kind of dismissive and not very nice towards their partners. Essentially, when they feel like they're being abandoned or pushed away, they tend to react very negatively and may say some really mean things and hurtful things to their partners in those situations. They're often highly manipulative in relationships, attempting to deal with to keep the person under their control. So they tend to like to feel as though they have the control in the relationship. And it is believed that BPD arises out of a person's attempts to deal with deeply rooted insecurity and severe emotional disturbances that are ultimately rooted in emotionally difficult experiences, such as neglectful or abusive parenting. So in most cases of borderline personality disorder, it can be linked back to negative events that occurred during childhood, particularly in terms of abusive and neglectful parenting. So in order to cope with negative emotions, unfortunately, people with BPD tend to engage in impulsive, risky, or self-destructive behaviors. So they can be very emotionally volatile, and they tend to engage in some not-so-safe behaviors at times. Next, we'll talk a bit about narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance and an excessive need for attention and admiration, as well as intense self-doubt and fear of abandonment. So the central focus is on the narcissistic person's own feelings, and that leaves little space for empathy. So they have a hard time feeling sorry for others or kind of reflecting the emotions of others around them. Instead, they tend to be highly manipulative and put themselves first. People with narcissistic personality disorder tend to have a strong sense of entitlement. They believe that those around them should satisfy their demands, and they are likely to do whatever it takes to ensure their own success. So again, kind of hopefully you can see so far the pattern emerging within these disorders. So just kind of being manipulative and trying to put themselves first is characteristic of several of these disorders. Then we have histrionic personality disorder, which is a disorder characterized by excessive attention seeking and dramatic behavior. So the word histrionic actually comes from a Latin word meaning like an actor. So people who suffer from HPD, they tend to be very, very dramatic, very much kind of the world's their stage and they're playing a role and they want everyone to pay attention to them. People with histrionic personality disorder are typically high functioning. Their dramatic nature makes them seem vibrant and attractive socially, so they tend to kind of attract people to them socially, but similar to people with borderline personality and narcissistic personality disorder, they're not great people to be in a relationship with or to engage with. They often engage in self-indulgent and risky behaviors. They tend to be highly sensitive to criticism, so very emotional and manipulative within their relationships. So they tend to, again, feel that sense of entitlement, and they tend to manipulate the people that they are associated with in order to kind of paint themselves in positive light and make themselves feel better. So the key difference between HPD and other personality disorders is the flamboyance and exhibitionist tendencies that those with HPD display. So the fact that they are so kind of flamboyant and dramatic and very kind of out there, very socially, vibrant almost and attractive, that's what distinguishes HPD from the other personality disorders that we just discussed. Finally, we have antisocial personality disorder. And this is a disorder that I have looked into quite a bit because I think it's very interesting. However, I don't necessarily like how our text approaches it. So I'm going to give you the definition from the textbook, but then I'm also going to give you a bit of information based on old textbook and some other readings that I've done. So antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a profound lack of empathy or emotional connection with others, a disregard for others' rights or preferences, and a tendency towards imposing their desires, often violently, onto others regardless of the consequences for other people, or often when younger, other animals. So people with antisocial personality disorder, one of kind of the hallmarks is that it's it's characterized by a pattern of disregard and violation for the rights of others around them, and it has to have been pervasive since childhood. So it can't just be something that starts later in life. People to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, they have to have been exhibiting these characteristics from childhood onward. People with APD tend to be highly resistant to treatment, in part because individuals with APD are not alarmed or distressed by their actions. So despite the fact that they might be doing things that are criminal or that are, putting others at risk, they themselves are not alarmed by their actions. They don't see anything wrong with what they're doing. And so unfortunately, it's very hard to get them to admit that they have a problem and that they need treatment. The major issue that I have with how your textbook views antisocial personality disorder is that they say that it's often also referred to as psychopathy, and they kind of conflate the two, but it is not the same. I had to look into this more because this textbook is kind of implying that it is, but I found a really interesting article that I've highlighted here. It says click here for more info, by a person who actually created the checklist for psychopathy, and he kind of explains a little bit about how they differ. And so I've included the next 3 slides from my old notes as well to illustrate the difference. So you're not going to be tested on this next information, but I did want to bring it to your attention because I think it's a really important distinction to make, and I'm a little annoyed that the textbook is treating it in the way that it is. So as for what you need to know about APD, it would basically just be, the first couple points here, but I am going to briefly explain to you how APD came to kind of be a diagnosis and how it differs from psychopathy. So in 1976, a man named Hervey Cleckley popularized and standardized the word psychopath, which describes a person who lacks all conscience. So psychopathy is characterized by an inability to feel normal emotions. They're incapable not only of remorse, but also of fear of punishment, shame, guilt, and empathy. They lack emotional connection, which may cause them to behave cruelly and irresponsibly, often for thrill. So you can maybe see right away here from the definition of psychopathy that when we talk about APD, we're talking about someone who engages in criminal and reckless behavior, but they don't necessarily lack or are incapable of emotional response in general. They may have a lessened emotional response, but psychopathy is really characterized by an inability to feel normal emotions. Psychopaths can be charming. They tend to manipulate and deceive others. Some may be violent and sadistic, while others may direct their energies into con games or career advancement. So again, APD basically is characterized by that reckless and criminal behavior, but people with psychopathy, just because they don't exhibit emotional responses, it doesn't mean that they will necessarily be violent or sadistic or engage in criminal activity. Sometimes they may use their manipulation tactics and their charm to kind of get ahead in terms of career advancements. So they may have kind of emotional or economic abuse rather than physical. Psychopaths are believed to exist in all cultures and throughout history, although they are more prevalent in Western society. So the idea of psychopathy kind of changes slightly in terms of the symptoms and the way it's displayed from culture to culture, but psychopathy as we define it here is more prevalent in our Western society than in other places. In the 1990s, clinicians revising the DSM decided to replace the term psychopath with antisocial personality disorder. So the textbook got one thing right in saying that they were kind of associated with each other, because basically what happened is psychopath was kind of a diagnostic disorder that was listed in the DSM, and it has since been replaced with antisocial personality disorder, which are people who show a pervasive pattern or disregard for and violation of the rights of others. And so basically psychopathy was replaced by APD in the DSM, but that doesn't mean they're the same disorder. People with APD break the law, they're impulsive and thrill-seeking, they're reckless with their own safety and or that of others, they often get into fights and physically assault others, and they're irresponsible. So all of these things, you may see some of these characteristics in people with psychopathy as well, but not necessarily, which is why I and many other psychologists would disagree with saying that they're the same thing. A crucial criterion for diagnosis, which I already mentioned, is that these problems have existed since childhood. So the DSM made the change in labeling to emphasize the behavioral signs of APD, but to many clinicians, the defining essence of a psychopath is their heartlessness and conniving charm. People who commit crimes vary in their motives for doing so. So basically what this is saying is that despite the fact that it has been changed in the DSM to reflect those patterns of criminal behavior and recklessness that are associated with APD, that doesn't necessarily indicate that somebody has that lack of emotional capacity that's really kind of characteristic of a psychopath. People with APD also vary in their capacity for empathy, remorse, guilt, and loyalty. So therefore, not all people with APD are psychopaths. Some people with APD might experience relatively normal emotional reactions, but they still kind of lack that sense of empathy or guilt for doing harm to others. Conversely, not all psychopaths are antisocial or aggressive in the way it's typical of APD. Sometimes when the two disorders do converge, you get the really extremely sadistic, cold-blooded killers that you've probably heard about in the media, but just because somebody has APD, they're not necessarily a psychopath, and vice versa. It's clear that APD and psychopathy are similar conditions with similar diagnostic criteria, but many argue that the two are readily dissociable and the diagnosis of APD is useful in psychiatric settings. Most psychopaths would meet the criteria for APD. A lot of people who have that lack of emotional connection and lack of remorse and guilt, they do exhibit behaviors that would be characteristic of APD, but most people with APD are not psychopaths. So they don't exhibit the extreme lack or complete loss of emotional reaction that people with, that's kind of characteristic of psychopaths. And differentiating between the two is perhaps most important in legal settings, because a convict with APD alone is not nearly as likely to reoffend as somebody who is both a psychopath and kind of considered to have APD. Because people who have APD alone, they may still have some kind of emotional connection. They can feel some emotions and perhaps can be kind of taught to experience some empathy or guilt, whereas people who have APD and psychopathy, nothing you can do or say is going to make them kind of feel like they, what they did was wrong, because they don't have that capacity to feel those emotions, including guilt. So I want to just point out the difference. If you want to ignore these 3 slides, feel free, but if you want to listen, that's my little spiel on the difference between psychopathy and APD, and I did, before writing up this section, verify the fact that a lot of people think they aren't the same by researching. I even read part of the companion guide to the DSM that I have here, and it doesn't mention in APD anything about that complete lack of emotional response that would be characteristic of a psychopath. So in my mind, they're not the same thing. But again, this won't be tested on. It's just more of a kind of interesting information for you. So moving on to some material that does come from this textbook. In terms of the biopsychosocial approach to personality disorders, so kind of where they come from, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to focus too much on talking about the causes of these disorders just because we simply don't have enough time. But you should keep in mind that with pretty much all of these disorders, there are going to be different types of factors that converge and interact in terms of kind of contributing to their onset. So we've talked about the biopsychosocial approach before, so we're going to talk about the fact that there are biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors that are associated with the onset and the prevalence of a lot of these disorders. So it's very difficult when we talk about personality disorders to identify their causes because they seem to arise from multiple factors over a long period of time. Psychological factors that may contribute to personality disorders include negative self-belief, and much of the dysfunctional patterns that we see in personality disorders result from attempts to compensate with these negative self-beliefs. So even someone who is very narcissistic and may exhibit narcissistic personality disorder, that doesn't necessarily mean that they really have positive self-beliefs about themselves. Sometimes their actions are simply trying to compensate for a lack of kind of self-esteem. Adults with antisocial personality disorder and children with what we call conduct disorders, which is thought to be a precursor to APD, have difficulty learning tasks and following complex rules. So they do have some issues in terms of their cognitive functioning. In terms of sociocultural factors, personality disorders often involve extensive emotional damage from childhood experiences. So I mentioned this with borderline personality disorder, but in personality disorders in general, we tend to see kind of issues that are arising kind of in terms of traumatic experiences stemming from childhood, so physical or sexual abuse during childhood, as an example. And then biological predispositions for personality disorders do appear to exist as well, involving a number of specific genes that seem to affect serotonin systems in the brain. And serotonin, I've probably mentioned it before in terms of being a neurotransmitter that's associated with your mood, and we'll definitely talk about it a lot more in the next chapter when we start talking about treatments and therapies, because many of the treatments, the biological or medical treatments associated with mental disorders involve something that acts upon serotonin systems within your brain. So we'll come back to that. Now we'll talk a bit about dissociative disorders. So that was kind of it for our little section on personality disorders. Dissociative disorder is a category of mental disorder characterized by a split between a person's conscious awareness and their feelings, cognitions, memory, and identity. So these disorders can include dissociative fugue, which is honestly fascinating in a morbid way. It's a period of profound autobiographical memory loss. So people in fugue states may develop a new identity in a new location. So essentially what happens, it's usually in the wake of some kind of traumatic experience, and the person literally loses all sense of self. They forget who they are, and they may flee the country and start a new life somewhere else with a new identity and not have the ability to access information about their past. They just completely lose that sense of self. Sometimes these states can persist for a very, very long period of time, and people who experience dissociative fugue, they're sometimes really difficult to find if their family members and friends are searching for them, because they just up and leave so abruptly. So it's kind of a very fascinating disorder, but one that can have a very obviously negative impact on somebody's functioning and their life. The second dissociative disorder that I want to talk about is depersonalization disorder, which is essentially more of a feeling of the surreal. So people who, again, you'll notice that a lot of these dissociative disorders, they seem to arise from traumatic experiences, but depersonalization disorder is basically kind of often in the wake of a traumatic experience. You tend to feel that you're not quite connected to your own body. So it's a feeling of disconnection from one's regular identity and awareness, almost like you're kind of an outside observer looking in. So it's when we say dissociative disorder, really we're talking about a split, typically a split between a person's conscious awareness of who they are and their feelings and cognitions and memory, as is defined in the definition. And so basically they feel like they've kind of split or broken away from who they are. They're disconnected. And then finally, dissociative amnesia is a severe loss of memory for a specific stressful event when no biological cause for amnesia is present. So basically, in the wake of a traumatic event, typically, the person will just lose all memory of any information associated with that event, even though there's no biological cause, such as a kind of traumatic head injury, that has contributed to this type of amnesia. And now we get to talk about the most familiar and controversial member of this category, which is dissociative identity disorder. You've probably heard of it before, even if you haven't heard that term. If you've ever heard anyone say multiple personality disorder, this is what they're talking about. So dissociative identity, we're literally saying you dissociate or split between your identities. So a person is experiencing a split in identity such that they feel different aspects of themselves as though they were separated from each other. So basically, it can become severe enough that the person constructs entirely separate personalities, only one of which will generally be in control at a time. So again, also known as multiple personality disorder, and it is a very rare and very controversial disorder for many reasons, which we'll talk about. So the personalities or alters may be very different from each other in terms of their gender, their sexuality, their memories, and their autobiographical senses of self. So they really do, in essence, seem like they are separate personalities. In most cases, dissociative disorders such as dissociative identity disorder, or DID, are thought to have been brought on by extreme stress. Some psychologists have hypothesized that during a traumatic experience, individuals may shift their consciousness in order to cope with what's happening to them. So basically, if they went through, traumatic experience such as kind of recurrent abuse during childhood, in order to cope, they may start to kind of try to split away from reality and kind of have that split in consciousness. And so a lot of the time, people who exhibit symptoms of DID, people tend to say that they're basically using their alters to kind of protect themselves and to help them kind of separate and cope with negative experiences. So, in talking about dissociative identity disorder, we have to ask, is the disorder real? And there's no easy answer for that. It's definitely a very rare disorder. It affects about only 1% of psychiatric patients. So that's saying 1% of people who are hospitalized or being treated for psychiatric conditions. And of course, 1% of that population is a very, very small subset of the overall population. There have been long-standing controversy over whether the disorder is real or not, and many cases have been proven to have been faked. A lot of the time, the disorder is almost created in patients who are kind of vulnerable and easily susceptible to influence by their therapists, unfortunately. Importantly, though, in many cases, the alters begin to feel real to the patient. So despite the fact that in some cases the disorder may not necessarily be kind of real, it may have been kind of almost created in the mind of the patient due to therapy or other issues, other kind of outside influences, the alters begin to feel real to the patient. They really believe that they have multiple identities. So tests of memory dissociation has suggested that some types of learning do not transfer between alter identities, which is kind of interesting. It seems like if one learns something, it doesn't necessarily mean the others do, which would provide some support for the case of multiple identities existing. Recordings of brain activity have also shown different frontal lobe activity in people with dissociative identity disorder when experiencing each of their alters. So if you actually look at the brain activity, you can see that it'll differ from alter to alter. However, that doesn't necessarily indicate that there are different people, because a lot of the time when we engage in different tasks and different ways of thinking, our brain activity is altered as well. So it doesn't necessarily indicate the existence of multiple identities. So overall, there is no solid evidence for a biological basis of DID. We've been researching it, but it's not really something that we found a lot of support either way for, either for or against. One very questionable aspect of dissociative identity disorder is the huge change in the number of cases reported over time. So by 1970, there were only 79 documented cases of DID, but by 1998, the number of reported cases had risen to over 40,000. And just kind of looking at that from a statistical standpoint, it doesn't really seem possible. It doesn't seem realistic that so many cases would have kind of occurred in such a short period of time, especially given how rare the diagnosis seems to be. So, or should be, I guess. So also 80% of patients who were diagnosed with DID were unaware of having the disorder before therapy. So this kind of begs the question of whether or not dissociative identity disorder may be something that has its origin within the context of therapy. Maybe in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily a disorder that the person comes into therapy with, but it may be something that's almost created or kind of suggested within the context of therapy. So if we asked why did these numbers skyrocket, it could be awareness. It could be that, people became more aware of the disorder and were more willing to kind of diagnose it. But it could also be, and this seems a little bit more likely, that some psychologists who were fascinated with the idea of the disorder became more willing to diagnose it. And so they may have interpreted symptoms through this framework or even provoked dissociative symptoms in the context of therapy. So basically, some therapists may have become kind of fascinated with the disorder and almost kind of wanted to see patients with it or be able to kind of help treat patients with it, and therefore they may have either suggested or kind of outright almost created or provoked dissociative symptoms within the client in the context of therapy. Because obviously when people go to therapy, they're going because they are very vulnerable in one way or another. And so it could be the case that unfortunately therapists, maybe even unwillingly or unintentionally, are taking advantage of these vulnerable clients and kind of creating these ideas in their mind. So regardless of what you believe about whether or not DID is real, there are definitely some issues in terms of being able to diagnose it accurately, because it's not really possible to prove definitively one way or the other whether or not alternate personalities exist. And we do see that cultural differences in the disorder would suggest a predominantly sociocultural disorder, so that it is predominantly may be caused by social and cultural influences rather than biological or psychological origins. So that is it for this section. That's the end of Module 2. So hopefully you enjoyed our little discussion of personality and dissociative disorders. I myself find this information fascinating, obviously. I actually will be beginning a clinical psychology program in the fall. So this is what I really do want to study. And so I hope you enjoy this discussion. And now I am going to try and take some time and record Module 3 and post it for you so you can have them both up tonight, that being Sunday night. And then hopefully I will get the schizophrenia module finished and posted for you by tomorrow evening. Thanks for listening.